here in person, and I understand we have some folks online as well. I am using the mic, sir. Yep. So my name is Zach Moore. I'm the Vice President of Government and Community Relations for Penn State. I am going to try to ably stand in for President Barron, who apologizes for not being able to be here today. Can you imagine a university president without a voice? Oh, the horror. Yeah, exactly. I'm happy to be here to introduce my longtime friend and colleague, Charlie Dent. Charlie spent 7 years in the U.S. House of Representatives and 14 years in Harrisburg in service to his fellow Pennsylvanians. This semester, we're fortunate he is with Penn State, teaching the course American Politics and World Programs with the McCourtney Institute's Managing Director, Chris Beam. I'm told our students love hearing from Charlie, and it's providing an incredible opportunity to broaden our undergraduate students' worldview. But to be honest, I'm not sure which task is more difficult. Negotiating with members of Congress whose beliefs and politics often prevent compromise, or holding the attention of a class full of college students for 50 minutes. Either way, I'm sure Charlie is using all of his considerable skills to be effective. Charlie is currently serving as the McCourtney Institute for Democracy's inaugural fellow. We're very grateful he is sharing his wisdom and experience in a wide range of other classes and public forums such as this one. And he has plenty of expertise to share. He represented the 15th Congressional District, which include all or parts of Berks, Dauphin, Lebanon, Lehigh, and Northampton counties in Pennsylvania. He was first elected to that seat in 2004. And before that, Charlie served 8 years in the PA House of Representatives and 6 years in the state Senate. While in Congress, Charlie chaired both the House Appropriations Subcommittee on Military Construction and Veterans Affairs and the House Ethics Committee. Those are some stories we wish we could hear, but I understand Charlie is sworn to secrecy on those. He's also co-chaired the Tuesday Group and served on the House Appropriations Committee. Charlie was one of the strongest advocates for Penn State in all of Congress, especially when it came to supporting federal funding for student financial aid programs and scientific research, particularly in areas of defense, energy, and basic fundamental science. In 2014, the Science Coalition, an organization of the nation's leading public and private research universities, including Penn State, presented Charlie with a Champion of Science Award in recognition of his strong commitment to funding basic research. In 2016, Charlie was honored with the Friend of Penn State Award for the significant role he has played in the continued improvement of Penn State and his commitment to the citizens of the Commonwealth. And I think we actually celebrated that in this room, if I remember correctly. We're proud that Charlie is one of our own, a Penn State alumnus who earned a degree in Foreign Service and International Politics. He also earned a master's degree in Public Administration at Lehigh University. And now to the main event. Charlie will be taking questions after his lecture, both from in-person attendees and those watching online. And for full disclosure, in case you see me sneak out the back at some point, I've already shared with Charlie, and he's pleased to know that I'm putting family first. I have a family obligation that I'm going to have to get to. So unfortunately, I won't be able to stay for the whole lecture, but please join me in welcoming former U.S. Representative Charlie Dent.
Breathe. Okay, well, thank you all, and Zach, thanks for that very kind introduction. Best to President Barron. Let's face it, loss of voice is an occupational hazard in his line of work, as it is in life of politicians. Tough thing to do without a voice, but thank you. It's a great honor for me to be part of the McCourtney Institute for Democracy as the inaugural visiting fellow. It's a real pleasure to be back here on campus. I graduated in 1982, so it's been a while. I've been back here many times, obviously, but it's nice to be back and to interact with the students. And I have to confess that being able to walk around campus between classes brings back great memories. And I must say that the campus looks better than ever. I mean, it really is it was always a beautiful campus, but I don't know, it just looks better now for some reason than I remember it. So credit to everybody on the ground staff and all those involved with making this campus as beautiful as it is. Since Zach brought it up, and he said I was sworn to secrecy. Where are you, Zach? There you are. Yeah, since I'm sworn to secrecy, when you serve on the Committee on Ethics, the House Ethics Committee, you know, everything you do in that committee is basically confidential because you're dealing with sensitive investigations of staff and members, and reputational damage can occur just as if an allegation becomes public. It can be a very serious issue. And some people ask, you know, how did I get on the committee? And I'll tell you how I got on the committee, and I'll tell you a few little stories about that committee. I can talk about a lot of things now. Some of the stuff we did is now public, but if it's an active investigation, couldn't talk about it. But I'm out now, so I'm liberated. After the 2008 election, after the Democrats, you know, Obama wins the presidency, Democrats strengthen their control of the House and the Senate. I just completed my third, let's see, 4, 6, 8, that was my third election for Congress. And after the election, I went to then Minority Leader John Boehner. And I said, John, I called him. I said, hey, John, I'd like to get a seat on the House Appropriations Committee. Now, I knew at that moment that I wasn't going to get the seat because Republicans had lost seats in the House, and that meant our allocation for the Committee on Appropriations went down, and there wasn't enough turnover, but I wanted to put my oar in the water, so to speak. Just kind of make sure I was out there, because I thought in 2010 I'd have a great shot at getting it. And so I got in there early, and he says to me, yeah, you know, you do a great job on that committee. I'll get back to you. So 2 days later, he calls me back. He says, hey, Charlie, I want you to serve on the Ethics Committee. I said, John, I asked you for the Appropriations Committee. He says, I know you did. I said, so John, I take it this is all about future consideration. He said, yeah, you learn fast, and you got to eat your vegetables around here before you get dessert. so I get on the committee, and that happens. And of course, there's a big wave. Republicans wave big time, and I get on the Committee of Appropriations 2 years later. I would have gotten on the committee anyway, probably in hindsight. But, so I did my 2 years on ethics, and then actually it was a 6-year tour of duty, and at the end of that tour of duty, that would have been that was around sometime in late 2014. I went back to then Speaker Boehner. I said, hey, John, I went to meet with him in his office. I said, John, you know, my tour of duty on the Ethics Committee is about to end. I've served my sentence. I want to go on the Intelligence Committee. And he said, you know, you do a great job on that committee, but I want you to be chairman of the Ethics Committee. I said, John, I served 6 years. We're term limited on that committee. You know, you're done. I can't, I'm done. He said, well, that's true. But he says, as Speaker, I can extend you 2 years if I make you chairman. And I used the word, I said, you're S-ing me, John. And he said, no, I'm not. He said, I'm serious. I said, but if you do this, I think in 2 years, you know, I'm sure we'll get you on you'll do great, we'll get you on the Intelligence Committee. I said, okay, that's fine, I'll do it. But then I said, hey, John, but what if you're not Speaker in 2 years? I said, what do you mean, what are you talking about? I said, well, just in the event you're not, you know, well, how do I make sure I can get this little agreement honored? And he said, well, why are you being a smart ass? I said, I'm not being a smart ass, it's just a serious question. So don't worry about it, it'll be fine. So okay, I served as chairman. Sometime 2015, the Pope comes to Washington. It was a very nice speech. Everybody pays attention. The next day, Boehner was so moved, he announces the next day he's resigning from Congress. And so there you go. And then Paul Ryan never honored the agreement. So what are you going to do? But that's a little story about the Ethics Committee. And the final story on that one, after I was first appointed in 2009, I guess it was, after the 2008 election, 2 Pennsylvania Congressional Democrats approached me on the House floor after hearing I'd been appointed to the committee. And they said to me, Jack Murtha was the congressman from Johnstown, Murtha wanted us to tell you something. I said, oh, that's interesting. Well, why isn't he telling me himself? They said, no, he just wanted us to tell you something. I said, what's that? They said, well, Murtha wanted us to tell you that we don't want anyone on the Ethics Committee who wants to be on the Ethics Committee. to which I responded, no, I didn't volunteer, I was conscripted, so you could tell Jack to relax. He was an unindicted co-conspirator during the Aspen scandals back in the day, and so he had an opinion about that committee. But it was a great experience, actually, and dealt with a lot of interesting I used to call it the head. I was like being head of internal affairs in the police department for Congress. I had a lot of very uncomfortable elevator rides with some of my colleagues, who were under investigation. And I can talk about some now. Charlie Rangel, you may remember, he got in trouble for failing to report income, and he didn't. We censured him. He didn't take it well. And there are other cases like that I got involved with it. I didn't have any gray hair before going on that committee, but it got very interesting. But it was a great experience. Nobody likes to have to enforce standards of conduct, but it has to be done. And it was in the end, it was actually a very good experience. I was warned, you go on that committee, it's just, you're going to lose a lot of friends. It's going to be difficult, and nobody wants to go on that committee. And in the end, I said, hey, it's better than being on the budget committee. I mean, some people thought that was a torture. I said, no, this is that is much worse. This was at least a good experience in the end. Now let me just get into what we're going to talk about today. Can Congress overcome partisanship? The answer is, I hope so. And is Washington irrevocably broken? I hope not. So lecture's over. No, that's what we want to talk about today. And I thought I'd just say a few things about how politics in my lifetime has changed. As I said, I graduated here from Penn State in '82, so I was 22 years of age. I ran for the State House for the first time in 1990. I guess I really started running in 1989, getting organized, so a little over 7 years after I left Penn State. So at the age of 29, I became a candidate, was elected at 30. And in 1990, and I'll talk about the Republican Party because I know it better. Being a Pennsylvania Republican at the time, we had people like Dick Thornburgh and Arlen Specter and John Hines, he came to a campaign event for me in 1990, about 6 months before he died in that tragic helicopter crash near Philadelphia. And we had people like them. Then Tom Ridge came along a few years later, and they all more or less came out of a tradition that I'll say was of Bill Scranton Sr., the former governor, who you may remember challenged Barry Goldwater for the presidency in 1964 at the convention. He lost, obviously, and who knows, if Scranton won that, it might have been a very different Republican Party. But so they came out of that tradition of Bill Scranton Sr., Hugh Scott, Senator Hugh Scott, you remember him? He was from Montgomery County in Pennsylvania. Senator Dick Schweiker, Richard Schweiker, who I believe was a Penn State alumnus too, if my memory serves me correctly. And they were kind of all out of that same tradition, if you will. And that's kind of the tradition I grew up in, and I was quite comfortable in it. But things have obviously changed. Back then, and actually even before then, but things were even changing at that time. Things were moving. These things don't happen all at once. It's an evolutionary process, the way parties change and politics change. It's usually, and we'll get into that with Trump. People say, oh, Trump caused all these problems. I always argued that Trump was a consequence, not a cause. That there were already problems. He's just an accelerant, gasoline on the fire, so to speak. But bottom line is, these parties have evolved. From what once were, I'll say broad coalitions that in some respects were not particularly coherent. They didn't always make a lot of sense. The Democratic Party, you had segregationist Southerners, union members in the North, various sorts of, ethnic groups and some, I'll say, people tend to be more left of center, all together, in one party. It didn't make a lot of sense. Republicans had Northeastern, Rockefeller, more liberal Republicans, and a lot of rural voters, particularly out in the West. And again, a coalition that didn't necessarily make a whole lot of sense. Not much of a presence in the South. And for much of the time, had done well with African American voters. That started to shift, though, during the Roosevelt years. And so these parties, but they shift. And now the parties, so you fast forward to today, and the parties, rather than being these broad coalitions, have shifted toward more ideological conformity or uniformity. They're much more aligned. I mean, just thinking in Pennsylvania for a moment, we had a governor named Bob Casey Sr. when I was first in the State House, and he was a pro-life Democrat. We used to refer to, in Pennsylvania, we had a term, we used to call them that Catholic or Casey Democrat, pro-labor, pro-life, pro-gun. That was a thing. That was a real thing. That was a significant block of Democratic voters at the time. You had people like Arlen Specter and Tom Ridge, who were pro-choice Republicans. And Barbara Hafer at the time was state auditor general. I mean, so So these candidates were not so neatly aligned with their, or these office holders in many cases, were not so neatly aligned with their, with their party's platforms, or what was perceived to be the position of the parties. And that, I think, is worth noting, that's how things have changed. So that's just one example here in Pennsylvania. But we've seen this throughout the country, which changed so much. A little family history. Some of you may or may not know this. My dad's sister, her name was Mary Dent Crisp. She grew up in Allentown. She was number 7 of 8 kids. My dad was number 8 and she was number 7. Well, when she was married, she moved to Arizona and she became the National Committee woman for, Republican National Committee woman for the state of Arizona, one of the two, and lived down the street from Barry Goldwater, actually, and was a friend, a neighbor. And this is back in the 1950s when she moved out there. And she became co-chair of the Republican National Committee, and she warned about how at that time, she was warning about how the party was changing. She was co-chair from 77 to 1980. She got in a big fight with Ronald Reagan over abortion rights and over the Equal Rights Amendment, which was a big issue back then. And she was warning about that they were going to drive women out of the party, and she was upset, and so she kind of was upset about the changes in the Republican platform at the time. And so, to a certain extent, I'd say she was probably right, that we've seen women migrate away from the Republican Party since then, especially more recent in the last few years. But we've seen that migration, and so again, like the parties they just change. I also wanted to mention something about coming from spending 14 years in the state legislature. I felt that Harrisburg, and Zach can attest to this, back then. Again, I was elected to Congress in 2004, so I had about 14 years in Harrisburg. And what I noticed then, that Harrisburg was a very pragmatic place. I mean, I felt that there were no deals that could not be cut. You had a Governor, Bob Casey, and a Senate leader named Bob Jubileer, who was very active here at Penn State. You had, but there were deals, they would reach agreements. Very pragmatic. And that was Harrisburg. Some might say painfully pragmatic. Others might say transactional. In fact, there were some leaders of the legislature who went to prison, who, when you take being transactional too far, you can actually get yourself in a lot of trouble. But the point is, it was a pragmatic place. They tended to avoid some of the more contentious issues, if possible, real divisive social issues. They kind of stayed away from it as much as they could, and were reasonably successful, at least during my tenure. And so that was Harrisburg. So I get to Washington in January of 2005, and I was just stunned, how not stunned, I guess I was a bit taken aback, I guess, by how ideological the place could be, excruciatingly ideological. I remember one of my first experiences, on the House floor, watching some House member from Vermont give a speech to the empty chamber. His name was Bernie Sanders. And I thought, my goodness, how does a guy like that get elected? I couldn't believe it. I said, wow, you couldn't get elected in my district saying this stuff. And by the way, Bernie was saying the same stuff then he's saying now. He's been very consistent, very consistent. But I just thought, wow, that's really pretty out there. I mean, I was really surprised. I just didn't see that in Harrisburg too much. Just didn't see it that much. Because we had rural Democrats, we had some urban Republicans, and it's a kind of more of a mishmash. But in Washington, things are a little bit more sorted. And so, but that was my first observation. What also I noticed too, what has changed in American politics, is how, I used to say candidates matter. I firmly believe that. I would say today they matter a lot less. They don't matter as much. And look right where we are today in this country. I'm going to think of a congressman from Ohio, Anthony Gonzalez, just announced he's not running again. Republican. Played football at Ohio State, was a star, went to the NFL, but he's on the wrong side of the party or the tribe. He's not running again. But you'd think with a resume like that, Ohio State guy, big football player, articulate, sharp guy, he's out. I mean, you think that's a nice pedigree to have. Or a guy like an Adam Kinzinger from Illinois. Air Force veteran, did tours of duty in Afghanistan, good-looking guy, sharp, on the wrong side. But again, with a pedigree like that, you'd think, oh, this guy's going to have a seat as long as he likes. But that's the reality. So the candidates, even though they might look good on paper, all of a sudden, if they're not as ideologically sorted as they need to be at this moment, they will have trouble. And I could argue the same thing is beginning to happen on the Democratic side, although happening more slowly, but it's getting there. I mean, you're seeing primary pressures for many of these members, particularly longer time, older ones. You remember Joe Crowley from New York State lost his primary to a young woman named Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. And Joe Crowley was like the king of Queens. King of Queens. He was an old school, Irish politician, about my age actually. He's kind of, very on the inside of the Democratic Party politics of Queens, kind of ran the show. Old school. Very progressive, but pragmatic, and replaced by somebody younger, next generation, more diverse. And you're seeing that pressure happening to a lot of Democrats throughout the country right now, where they're, even those who are, ideologically where they need to be, might not be on the right side of the demographic shifts that they're witnessing in their districts or maybe in the country. So this is happening quite quickly. And I always like to point this out, and I meant that about candidates mattering, but I'll take somebody in the news today, Joe Manchin. I know Joe very well. Senator from West Virginia. He just won his re-election by a few points a few years ago. 2020, I guess he won. And, of course, Donald Trump won that state. Or 2018, I think he won. I forgot what year he just ran again. But Joe Manchin won that state. Donald Trump won that state by nearly 40 points, and Joe Manchin won it by a few points. There aren't many people like that anymore who can defy political gravity. That is, they can actually win in areas where they have no business winning. But how does he do it? Well, he had his own brand. They kind of knew who he was. He's been around. He's a governor. He's a secretary of state. He was a state legislator. He had his own brand. This is a guy who took a high-powered rifle in 2010 and shot the cap-and-trade bill on a commercial. I don't even remember that. But, so he was kind of saying, I'm not like those Democrats in Washington. I'm a West Virginia Democrat. And, and good for him that he has that kind of a brand, because he wouldn't have won any other way in this most recent election, even though he always won comfortably before, but life has changed. There aren't many people like that. There are a few now. I could point to Brian Fitzpatrick in Bucks County. Biden won his district by 7 points, and Fitzpatrick, I think, won by 12 or 13 points. He won by double digits. In 2008, I had a district where I won my district by 18 points, while President Obama, and then Senator Obama, won my district for president by 13 points. There aren't a lot of people now who are able to represent districts that they're not supposed to represent. That is, they're representing a district where the other party may have an advantage in presidential elections or voter registration. There are very few like that anymore. And I think that, more than anything else, is contributing to the polarization and tribalization of our politics. It was always nice when I knew that there were people, these were the people who had to be, I always said, had to be careful. They could not just simply be a straight voting Republican or a straight voting Democrat if they wanted to survive, because these people have a different political calculation, a very different political calculation than those members in these very safe seats. The truth is, these members in these very safe seats are much more numerous now, and they all find that their political safety, their incentive, is to tack hard or move closer to their base. Stay there, that's where it's safe. They see their threat over their right shoulder or their left shoulder, if you're a Democrat. They have to worry about that threat every day. And since there's so many of them, so when it comes to putting together agreements or compromises, well, they realize there's no political safety there. You're in the middle of the road, you get run over. And the truth is that people who are in districts like mine or Manchin's, Susan Collins up in Maine, she's another one who defies gravity. these folks know they need to be able to appeal to folks who are not necessarily part of their base. And since there are fewer of those people, I think that is one of the biggest challenges and impediments to getting anything done in Washington. It's that simple. There just aren't enough of them. There are too few. And it's making life very difficult, not just on big issues. Now, they put together this infrastructure bill you've all read about, and, which I hope will pass the House, but they can do some things here and there. But actually, I was kind of proud of them because they were, it used to be a time when the leaders would negotiate big pieces of legislation like that. This was done by backbench members. They're the ones who negotiated the deal and forced it on the leaders. I think the leaders would have had a hard time doing this themselves, because what will happen to them? By their own members, many times they'll be accused of surrender or capitulation. And these leaders are elected by their members. And since there are more of their members, who are, tacking harder, to the hard left or the hard right, that's where their numbers are. To maintain your leadership post, you have to count those votes. That's what matters to them. And that's why they do things they do, even though you might argue this is not where the American public is on a lot of these issues, but that's where they need to be to maintain their positions. Because again, their own elections too are always going to be settled in a primary, never in a general election. So that is a real challenge. So the incentives are just misaligned now. The incentives are such that it's safer to do, it's much safer, to stay hard and close to your base. Some other things too, and one of the other challenges in our system and why it's so hard to overcome partisanship, people talk, is redistricting a problem? Yes. Is it the biggest problem? I don't think so. I think the bigger problem with respect to this polarization that we're facing, I think has more to do with the way we nominate candidates for office, primaries. And in some states they use conventions. Think of Virginia and Utah in particular that have really, what I consider to be really bad convention systems. I'm talking on the Republican side now, where, a friend of mine, a former congressman, he served one term, Denver Riggleman. You may have seen him from Virginia. He's a conservative guy, very strong national security background in the intelligence world and some military, I believe. And he wins an election, he gets elected, and he conducts or performs a same-sex wedding. Well, for some of his, that was a human rights violation. How could he dare do such a thing? Well, so he didn't get primaried. He loses his renomination at a convention in some church parking lot. I mean, that's how they do it. Or you remember Senator Bennett from Utah, who lost his primary, it was a convention in Utah, to a young upstart named Mike Lee, who is now the senator, one of the two senators from Utah. I mean, basically saying that Bennett was a good, solid Mormon and traditional conservative, pragmatic guy. He was a man who tried to get things done and was well respected, but he wasn't breathing fire every day, and he was out, and he was older, and it was a generational thing. Lee was younger, but this is what happens, and the primary systems too. And I would always argue that in many states and these closed primaries that have large multi-candidate fields can often nominate the more fringy elements of the party, and in some states too, where we have an overwhelming Republican or Democratic plurality or majority in that state, the general election is not an issue, and so that's how we get some of these characters, who are way out there on the fringe. I'll pick on one, Marjorie Taylor Greene down in Georgia. I mean, multi-candidate field, very conservative area, and somehow she had some money and she was able to break through in the primary. And and the only way you're going to beat her, they'll beat her, is in a primary. But this is the harsh reality that we find ourselves in. Our founders never anticipated primaries. Hell, they didn't really plan on political parties, and they knew about factions, they knew a lot of things, but they weren't clairvoyant. They couldn't see the future, obviously, completely. And so I think this is one of our biggest challenges. How do we nominate candidates who are kind of peeling more to the center. And I always like to follow up with this. In a congressional district like the one I held, it would shock some of my Republican friends when I would say to them, here's the math. In order for me or any Republican to win the seat, I need to win 85 to 90% of the Republican vote, over half the independents, and close to 30% of the Democrats. That's the math. And I usually was talking to somebody who was pretty hard on the right, and I'd say to them, well, how do I do that if I would carry on like you do? Or the way you would like me to carry on? How would I do that? How do I put together a winning coalition? And the truth is, I can't. If I did what you wanted me to do in this individual, I'd say, I'd come in with a comfortable 44% of the vote. That's called losing. That's called losing. And and I don't go through all this. I don't work this hard. Campaign this hard. Knock on all those doors. Do all the things you have to do for the exercise. Trying to win. And not trying to lose. But it's amazing to me how few people understand that. And I think it's important too that we discuss congressional dynamics, and especially since 2008. In 2008, not being the election of Barack Obama, 2008 being the year of the financial crisis, which I believe, really did ignite. There are problems. Look, problems preceded 2008, but that really, I think, ignited some of the anger in the country. A real deep recession, driven by a financial crisis, and you saw the rise of the Tea Party. At that moment. And you also saw on the left the rise of something called Occupy Wall Street. So they weren't as well developed perhaps as the Tea Party, but that was a real fire there. And so you saw a genuine anger. And I always argue that was the year that I grew up politically. That I realized that, when we have a crisis like that, and at that moment, remember, George W. Bush was the president and we had a Democratic-controlled Congress. And we were at a point where the Congress had to do something. We were in a point there where doing nothing, which is often the default position for the Congress, is doing nothing. But doing nothing was really not an option, and we didn't have a whole lot of good options. So you're back at the point of where you have to choose from a series of bad options, and so you take the least bad option. And I realized at that moment that there were a number of people there who were so fearful of their primaries. This is more on the Republican side at that moment. And they were in what I consider to be safe seats, but I thought in a time like this, well, this is a time you need to step up, particularly if you're in one of those safe seats. And I was just surprised how afraid so many were. And I'm in a marginal district, and this is not a good year for Republicans. And I said, my goodness, I'm in one of the most vulnerable districts in the country, and I'm going to step up. Somebody's got to step up. I can't wait for them. This is, if we go, this could potentially be economic Armageddon if we don't stabilize the financial services system of the country. As painful, as difficult as that is, nobody likes doing it. But I did have an assurance from Ben Bernanke, who was chair of the Fed at the time. I asked him before I voted for it. I called him. I had 3 or 4 other members who were really hesitant about this. I told the whip at the time, Roy Blunt, I said, well, I'll get 4 votes for this thing, but we need to have a conversation with the chairman of the Federal Reserve. I need to hear how bad it is, unvarnished. And we're not getting the full scoop, and I got to hear it from him. To justify $700 billion worth of funding, I want to make sure this is as bad as I'm hearing rumors. So I want to hear it from the guy. And he told me it was so serious and it could lead to a very serious economic consequence globally, and with cascading effects throughout the economy. And all sorts of people lose out. Potentially runs on banks, and I don't want to paraphrase what he said. I didn't write it down, but he assured me. He said, "I feel confident that we're going to collect or retrieve most of the money, if not all of it, maybe even make some money." And he was right. He actually did. And I saw him like a year or 2 later. I said, "Hey, how are we doing on the collections?" and we did well. But the point I guess I'm making is that's when that's when I first saw the anger. And you saw the Tea Party rise up, and you saw Occupy Wall Street doing their little things, pitching tents in the middle of cities and towns all over the place. But after that, in comes the Tea Party, and they weren't a monolithic group, by the way. These people who were elected Republicans during the Tea Party wave, I think there were about 89, 86 maybe new members of the House who came in at that time. 66, I think, of whom, 67 maybe, took seats back from Democrats. So it was a big, massive wave. And so we get in there. And what I found interesting about that bunch, there were a group of them. Many of them were pretty reasonable. Most of them, in fact, most of them were. But there were some who later, I would say, began, or were the original founders of the House Freedom Caucus. Them, and there are some others who had already been serving. This is kind of like I always called it the rejectionist wing of the party, the nihilistic wing, the guys who always wanted to blow things up every day. But there was that group, and they often felt like they thought we were living in a system not of separation of powers so much, but separation of parties, and they often behaved as if we were a parliamentary system. I remember I would be in meetings where they say, well, we need to pass this particular bill, and they would tell us how to do it and what would be in it, and I would be the skunk at the picnic and say, well, okay, we can pass your bill, we'll send it to the Senate, and then they're going to pull it apart, put it back together, they'll get 60 votes to pass it, and this is what it's going to look like. Vote for it? Well, heavens no. I mean, that would have been a human rights violation to vote for that kind of a capitulation, but that was what we dealt with many days. And what those guys did, what they effectively did, the Freedom Caucus, they were able to weaponize legislative procedure. I mean, I always said about those guys, and this is what I did respect this about them. These guys were never afraid to take a hostage. And they took a hostage, they meant it. And what they say, and I'm saying this figuratively, of course, if you're going to take a hostage, you better be prepared to shoot it. Well, those guys would shoot the hostage every single time. And I'll tell you what, that's why they were able to get their way in many cases. They could blow something up. They made a threat, they would make good on it. People who are more pragmatic, more moderate, they're not used to doing those kinds of threats. They don't like doing that. They don't like hostage taking, politically speaking. They don't like doing it. I've seen it right now. I'm seeing it right now on the left in this country with the infrastructure bill. The progressive wing, they took that bill hostage, and they threatened to take it down. And they were going to take it down, and they were going to shoot the hostage. And now that story is still unfolding until they get this larger reconciliation bill of up to some, who knows what it'll be at, but up to $3.5 trillion in new spending. So these tactics, I think some of the left are, they paid attention. They paid close attention. So, but again, but speaking to the issue of parliamentary voting patterns, I guess the most absurd evidence of this occurred during the 2017 Repeal Replace debate on Obamacare, the Affordable Care Act. I guess it would have been, when it was passed, I think the bill was passed in May of 2017. Bill to repeal and replace Obamacare passed the House. So what happened? They had a Rose Garden celebration at the White House with the president. It's like Penn State celebrating the football game after Auburn at halftime. Hey, we won. No, you have another half to play. I mean, this is how absurd it was. There was something called the Senate, and they have to deal with this too. And they're not just a little speed bump on the road to progress over there. I mean, you need them. They're going to be part of this. I mean, but it really spoke to this mindset of a parliamentary system. And like I said, I've often felt that the party of the president in Congress feels it's their obligation to protect the president at all costs. And again, whatever happened to separation of powers, we're talking about separation of parties. And as a consequence of all this, I would argue that the powers of the Congress have been weakening significantly, probably since the 1930s, but it's gotten only worse over time to the point now where some of my party can't even acknowledge an election outcome and then support a commission to investigate a real insurrection on the Capitol. And so I mean that's what's happened, and it's tragic. So gridlock in and of itself is not a terrible thing. I like our system of government. I think there are advantages to this. I mean, our founders were smart. They created these checks and balances, separation of powers. They wanted to make it difficult for bad people to do bad things, and they did. Now, the flip side of that, sometimes it makes it hard for good people to do good things sometimes, but if in order to get something signed into law here, we need a consensus within the country. And I'm just going to say one thing about the media and cultural dynamics, and I'm just going to just say one last thing about the filibuster, which has become a hot issue for many. And right now, and I always say that it's right now that I'll call the Democrats in the Senate the day traders, and some in the House, they're the day traders. They're saying, get rid of the filibuster, and we can do what we want to do, jam it. And I'd say it's I would argue it's a very short-sighted view, very short-sighted. Further, because I've told some of them, I said, I wish you could have been in the House Republican conference meetings with me in 2005, 2006, when Republicans had full control, or even when Obama was president, when the Republicans had control, and I would hear some of the most hard-edged Republicans stand up and say, we need to get rid of this filibuster so we can pass, these bills, many of which were not good, and the Democrats would have hated. I said, just remember, someday the shoe will be on the other foot. It'll be on the right foot, and you're not going to like what they do if you get. So, hey, don't get me wrong, filibuster's overused, it's abused. They should reform it, but they need to do that on a bipartisan basis, whatever they do. And if they want to, anybody else ever tells me again that, it's all about, it's a Jim Crow law. Well, I like to remind them that the 1964 Civil Rights Act and the 1965 Voting Rights Act passed into law in spite of the filibuster. Okay? So the filibuster didn't stop it. It wasn't the rules of the Senate that were the problems for African Americans in the South. The problem was what was going on down there, and then but the solution was there was a consensus in the country to do something about it, and you had strong majorities to do it. That's what you need. You need that. It had nothing to do with the rules. The filibuster didn't stop anything in regard to that, at least not in 64 and 65. So I always remind people of that, and it may not be the popular position at the moment, because I think the partisans right now, I'll tell you right now, if I said to some Republican in the House right now, and it speaks to the situational nature of politics, I guarantee you, those same guys I heard screaming about getting rid of the filibuster when Republicans were in charge, if you mention that to them right now, get rid of the filibuster, they tell you it's the worst idea in the world. So the politics is situational. If my guy's doing it, it's righteous and just. If your guy does the same thing 10 years later, it's a human rights violation. Okay? That's how the politics has become. It's tribal, but it's also situational. Look, there's always a certain amount of hypocrisy in politics. We kind of get that, a certain amount of dysfunction. But we've taken the fun out of dysfunction, nevertheless. But the hypocrisy at times is it's almost so overwhelming. It's so overwhelming when you hear some folks just take positions 180 degrees. Candidates used to be a lot more measured in their comments just for that reason, because they know that people are going to read their words back to them at some point, especially if you've been around for more than 5 minutes. You'd like to be somewhat consistent if you can be. It's not always possible, and you do change sometimes based on new information and facts. But that's kind of where it is now. Now people don't care. It doesn't matter. Just go with the herd. Wherever the herd goes, that's the place to be. Don't run against the herd. Let me just say one thing about media and social, the media dynamics, social media dynamics as well, and then we'll go right to your questions. I feel at times there's reality. There are those who are dealing in reality, and there are those who are not. There are a lot of people out there, who get their information from sources that are just not that are just not legitimate, or that are peddling conspiracy theories, falsehoods. And they're usually sites, of course, where there are no editors. Now, say what you will about traditional media. I've literally, I'm a CNN commentator, so it's traditional media. But I've really come to respect both print and broadcast where they have editors. So if I write op-eds for CNN from time to time, and I have to go through a review. I write it, and somebody reviews it. Hey, we need a citation for that, or then there's a copy editor too to look for other things. But they want to make sure that what I'm putting out there is at least the fact, not the opinion, but the factual stuff is indeed accurate. And I kind of like that we have editors. But there are a lot of sites out there are no editors, and people just put stuff out there. They breathe it, and out it goes. And just yesterday,
A great example, and this I'm going to go after Fox on this one, Fox News. Colin Powell dies. Okay, he's 84 years old. He dies. He was in bad health. He had cancer. He had Parkinson's. He had his vaccination. He had vaccination. So he dies. And before any of this information about his underlying health conditions gets out there, on Fox, when people were questioning the efficacy of the vaccines. Are they really effective? Because Colin Powell died, he's 84, he's vaccinated. Oh, there must be something wrong with the vaccine. Well, no, he had cancer. I mean, this guy was sick and he was he was compromised. I mean, this is what happened. So, but that was put out there. So how many people saw that? How many million people saw that? They see that, and okay, that's out in the ether now. And how do you pull? It's hard to put these genies back in the bottle once they're out there. And so that was just yesterday. I wouldn't have used that had it not it just kind of really stunned me that this was now being peddled. And then of course there are the extreme, QAnon groups, and I am just, it started perhaps back with the birther movement. I mean, I used to have people come in to see me about this. Obama wasn't born in the country, and I'd say to them, well, I met with the governor of Hawaii, and she told me she saw his birth certificate, and she told me that there were 2 notices in the Hawaiian newspapers at the time that he was born, back in 1961. I don't think this is a part of a grand conspiracy. I think he was born there. They put it in the paper, the newspaper. I mean, why are we having this conversation? These were the kinds of things you're dealing with. And so it went back that far. But it gets amplified. These messages get amplified though on social media. And some other media too, broadcast television media and talk radio and elsewhere, and it's really problematic. And I also just mention one thing too. You may remember, part of the challenge too, and many shows now on cable news and on talk radio. I think there's a great conflation now between news and opinion. It makes life more difficult for all of us. News and opinion. What I do on CNN when I go on the shows, I'm commenting on the news of the day. I am not a journalist. I do not provide content in terms of producing I'm not the guy producing the news, writing the stories. I'm commenting on what they're doing, but I'm not producing it. And I think there are a lot of people out there, who might get confused. They hear something, they watch an opinion show at night and pick your favorite network, and they might think that's news. And I'm not always sure they're as discriminating as they need to be about the difference between news and opinion, and they're conflated. And I think that's not a small problem in this world. And to show you the power of those folks on the outside, in John Boehner's recent book, I just forgot the title, On the House is the title of the book, he writes about how an experience that happened with Michelle Bachmann, who was a firebrand congresswoman from Minnesota, Republican. And she was always going on Fox News and on all these talk radio shows, and she said a lot of things, frankly, that were really far out there and oftentimes inaccurate. And I'm being charitable. And she basically, she wanted a seat on the House Ways and Means Committee, and Boehner probably would have rather set himself on fire than put her on the Ways and Means Committee. We put the most serious members on committees like that. We put people on there who were, doing the work and, not grandstanders. And she basically said, if you don't do that, I'm going to go to Rush Limbaugh and Sean Hannity, and I'm going to say, this is what you do to members who help put you in the speaker's job. I'm going to basically realizing that, and Boehner acknowledges that, she had the power to go over there and basically level that threat against him. So he figured a way out of it. It was pretty clever, actually. He put her on the Intelligence Committee. Because you're on the Intelligence Committee, you can't talk about what you're doing. It's behind closed doors, and she couldn't run her mouth on that. And she actually did a good job on the Intelligence Committee. She actually did the work. But so it was really interesting how that happened. That was the way he kind of diffused it. But that's what we deal with. And I'll just say on the cultural dynamics that are affecting this country. We seem to politicize everything. Not more than during this pandemic. Wearing this is a political issue. Wearing a mask, getting the vaccination, as a political issue. I mean, there's so many things that we have politicized in this country that we never thought were political. Football games, you take a knee or don't take a knee. I mean, it just seems like everything is so damn political. It gets ugly, and you got these other groups out there now too on the fringes, the Proud Boys, Antifa, white supremacists, and as I always like to remind people that whatever challenges that this country faces, external threats, whether it's Russia or Iran, the competition with China and other adversaries, our threats, our challenges to this republic, are much more internal at this point than they are external. I mean, as bad as the Russians were with interfering with the elections, the Russians aren't going to change our system. But we will if we don't get it right. And so that's the conclusion that I wanted to make. That's what I wanted to conclude on, that there is really no good answer to the question, are we going to be able to overcome partisanship, and is Washington irrevocably broken? The answer, again, I hope we can recover. I think we can recover, but until the incentives are realigned, it's going to be hard. And I suspect we're going to go through a rough period. Was like January 6th, and we all watched that. I was on CNN that day when it happened. I like to remind people that was the best ratings they'd ever had in their history, so I'm taking full credit. But seriously, obviously, it was the insurrection. Commenting on it, I just remember how upsetting that was. I mean, for me to watch that in real time, and I was thinking, but I was hoping at that. Well, this is the end. Okay, now we've reached now we've crossed the Rubicon. Now we have to come back. I thought that was the end, but starting to think maybe it's not the end, but the beginning of something that's worse. And to watch that one guy, and the image that I remember that day, I commented, the guy walking across the Capitol with a Confederate flag over his shoulder. I was just stunned to see that, just kind of like just sauntering through the rotunda. And I always reminded people, and I'll conclude on this comment, that when I watched that, I said on television at the time, I said, I wish all Americans could go into the Capitol right by the front door in the main entrance there. There's a plaque right by a bust of Abraham Lincoln. And the plaque says, this plaque is dedicated to those who answered the call of Abraham Lincoln to defend the Capitol at the time of the Confederate Rebellion. And on that are several units several military units from Pennsylvania, one of which from my hometown of Allentown, the Allen Rifles. It's a group from Pottsville, a group from Reading, I think there was one from Philadelphia, Massachusetts, New York. These are the ones who first showed up and were stationed in the Capitol to protect it from Confederate rebels, and who never, by the way, entered the Capitol. And so I just thought, my goodness, we've fought a civil war, our people defended the Capitol, and just to see that symbol of the Confederacy, wandering through on a day where they're trying to, undermine and disrupt the constitutional order, the peaceful transfer of power, was just almost surreal to me to be watching this in real time. And so, so that's the point where we are today in America. And with that, on that happy note, I thought I'd conclude and go right to your questions or comments, either in person or virtually.
So I'm going to come up, I'm going to take a seat.
Oh, sit down, sure.
We've got questions that have come in online, and happy to take your questions in person as well. I think we're going to be going around with a microphone for questions in person, and we'll just give the CNET staff here a minute to get everything switched over. And thank you all again for coming today, and thank you to Matt and the team at CNET for all of your work. Thank you to Carrie and the team here at HINTS for making all of this happen. So,
Jenna, why don't you introduce yourself?
I guess I should. I'm Jenna. I'm the communication specialist for the McCourtney Institute for Democracy. We have been getting questions in online, so we'll start with one or two of those, and I'm happy to go to your questions here in the room as well. To that point about incentives you were talking about before, I know you mentioned opening up the primaries might be a good way to sort of start to change some of that, but we had a question come in about ranked choice voting. What do you make of that, and how if at all, might it help some of the dynamics you were talking about?
Yeah, ranked choice voting, I don't pretend to be an expert on that subject. The state of Maine has implemented it. And so you know, because just remember, in Pennsylvania, we're a winner-take-all state. So in your primary, whoever gets the most votes, first across the line wins. So you only need a plurality does it. So if there are 10 candidates in the race and the top vote getter gets 25% of the election, the vote, that person will be the nominee. In many states, though, that's not the way it works. In many states, they have what they call runoffs. You have to get 50% in your primary to be the nominee. So if you have 10 candidates running, then the two top vote getters, say one gets 30% and one gets 25%, those two then have to go into the runoff, and then one of them will get 50%. So ranked choice voting is kind of a way to avoid a runoff where you can rank your votes. So here's my first choice, second choice, and so it's kind of complicated, actually. And that's why I'm a little hesitant. What's that? Can't hear me? Oh, okay. Let's do this. Let's get this. I got that. How about that? There we go. There we are. So so ranked choice voting is a way then to select a nominee, and you can do the general election the same way if there are 3 candidates, and basically you avoid runoffs. So you can avoid a runoff, and the belief is that by ranking the votes, your votes, that the more pragmatic candidates can prevail. I'm not sure that that's true. Jenna, you might have a better opinion than I do on it, but it's a reform that they've done in Maine, and a few other places are looking at it. And again, some think that will help moderate things a little bit.
Another question here. So you were talking about some of this sort of dichotomy between gerrymandered districts and safe districts, and I wonder if the only way, if primaries are problematic, as you said, but they're the only way for candidates to break through in gerrymandered districts, what's the answer or the path forward from that?
I always like to point out in Pennsylvania, even when we had the more gerrymandered maps before the court changed them around in 2018, I would suggest to you that in Pennsylvania, we had several competitive districts, even when things were gerrymandered. I could point out like the seat I held, the one to the south of me that's held by Fitzpatrick, the one that was the Chester County seat that was held by Costello, now Houlihan, the one that was held by Pat Meehan was also competitive. Those are just 4. The one that's held by Matt Cartwright up in the Northeast is a competitive seat. Now, there are 18 seats. There'll soon be 17, but I just listed off, I think, 5 or 6 seats out of 18 that were pretty darn competitive, one way or the other. And then they redrew the lines, and they still had about the same number of competitive seats. The point I'm making is this seat up here, this one I think is now Fred Keller, used to be G.T. Thompson, but I couldn't draw a competitive district up here. Okay, I have the Island of State College, all right, the Island of State College, but if I were to try to draw a Democratic district up here, I would have to draw one hell of a gerrymander. I have to take it straight down to Harrisburg or probably out to Pittsburgh. And that would be your connector. I mean, it would be an ugly district. So no matter how you're going to draw a district up there, it's going to have a strong Republican lean. So some districts, both on the right and the left, in Philadelphia, no matter how I draw a seat, it's going to be a Democratic seat. Okay? An overwhelming one. So you just have to accept that you're going to have a lot of safe seats no matter what, just because of the way people live. And by the way, Democrats are not as well distributed as Republicans. They tend to be overly concentrated in urban areas. And so as a consequence, they waste a lot of votes. Republicans tend to be more distributed, better distributed, and that's why you'll have situations where there'll be more Democrats in a state, but they'll elect more Republicans, but the Democrats are all compacted into a few areas. And that's a challenge for the Democratic Party. How do you broaden your appeal? But that's what we're up against. So you can do independent commissions. You can do all sorts of things to help you get better or fairer maps. But even those things get political too. I mean, this, by the way, redistricting is the most political of all processes. And my hands are not clean. I mean, I was in the legislature, believe me, I know what it's like to draw a map and vote on a map. It's a nasty experience. Everybody there, I used to remind my congressional colleagues, after having come from Harrisburg, I said, look, don't get mad at them. They're going to draw the maps. They're not drawing the maps for you. They're drawing them for themselves. Okay? Just remember that when you talk to them. So bite your tongue, mind your manners, and they can get very vindictive very quickly.
Anybody in the room have a question? I'll repeat it for the folks watching at home. Just raise your hand. Or, I'm sorry, Jenny's coming around with a microphone if you have a question.
Questions, objections, comments?
Carolyn Donaldson, I asked to put some good questions together, and looks like you have.
Well, playing off of the redistricting, let's talk about term limits. Another political hotbed issue and one that is highly contentious. Your thoughts now on that process?
I never really had a problem with term limits, believe it or not.
I just thought they have to be, I always thought 6 terms in the U.S. House, 2 terms in the U.S. Senate, maybe 3 terms in the U.S. Senate. I really don't have a problem with term limits per se. I don't think it'll ever happen at the federal level because it would require a constitutional amendment. But having said that, you know, voters have done a pretty good job imposing term limits in recent years. We've had an enormous amount of turnover in the U.S. Congress. You think about it. We've had a change of power in the Congress. I'm trying to guess, where the body has either gone from the House or the Senate or the presidency has flipped. In most of the last, since 2000, there was a flip in 2002, went back to Republican. I could just show you 2006, 2008, there was a change. 10, there was a change. 14, there was a change. 16, there was a change. 18, there was a change. And there were actually changes in one body or the other. Like House went from Democrat to Republican, Republican to Democrat, Senate, or the presidency. We've had a lot of turnover in these bodies, and things are kind of really they're hopping politically. I mean, since I left Congress, I'm guessing at least 25%. I used to know the number. And I only left 3 years ago, but I think we've seen close to more than 25% of the House Republicans are no longer there when I served. And I think it's higher than that now, actually. I'll find that number. Somebody can probably Google that. How many, since 2018, how many House Republicans have left? Quickly Google that. It's a stunning number. And just to show you the amount of turnover. So term limits was the rage when it was believed that, you know, people were apathetic and we just didn't have a lot of turnover. But a lot has changed since that term limit movement began.
So, you know, thinking about these forces that we've seen as you've described, both on the left and the right, there's, you know, some pretty catchy slogans, drain the swamp, and, you know, whatever the equivalent of that would be on the left. And so how do the moderates, the pragmatists, folks like you, how do you counter that from a messaging standpoint?
Yeah, I should probably point out too, sometimes I conflate, and I shouldn't, conflate the terms moderate and pragmatist. There are a lot of people down there who are, I can deal with strong conservatives or strong progressives, you know, so long as they have pragmatic streaks. I mean, I've witnessed some who are very strongly conservative or strongly liberal, and they would work together on a bill, and they'd figure out what the other cannot do, and so they figure out what they can agree to, and they pass bills. That's called pragmatism. That's a good thing. So you can still be a strong conservative or strong or proud progressive, and you can still get something done. So what's the question about that?
So how do you counter drain the swamp and other sort of more extreme messaging?
You know, I think part of it comes down to, in the words of the Cowardly Lion, courage.
I think there's just too much fear out there that if a member of Congress takes a risk, they're so fearful that they're going to be primary. And I remember I took a risk in 2013. I thought I was going to I made a career-ending decision. When, at that time, Ted Cruz wanted to shut down the government to defund Obamacare. And I recognized
many months before it was going to happen, how this was going to play out. And I talked to the leaders. I said, this is really one of the dumbest ideas I've ever seen. One, because it'll never work. And even if it did work, there's an easy way to work around it. And I won't get into the details of discretionary appropriations bills and mandatory or entitlement spending and how they can move the money around. But I said, it just wouldn't work, even if it were successful. And it won't be successful because the Senate was Democrat controlled. They never passed such a thing. And even if the Senate passed it, you know, a guy named Obama, President Obama, would not sign it in the law. He's just not going to do that. And you'd end up shutting down the government, and it would be a mess, and you're just going to pass a clean funding bill. So I decided to say all this stuff publicly, thinking, oh boy, I'm going to cause a lot of problems. And I got myself a lot of attention for that. And on a national front page story in the New York Times. I told my kids, I said, if I ever get in the front page of the New York Times because I did something really stupid or really naughty. And so there it is. It was a good story. And I was like shocked. And then so the government shuts down. I keep running my mouth saying this is a terrible idea. And okay, and then Republicans' numbers are taking hits all over the country. And some groups were doing polls. And they did like 20 members in more competitive districts. And my numbers went up. And I thought, I thought I committed suicide here. And actually, this kind of worked out fine for me. I said, I didn't even have an opponent in 2014 on either side. I couldn't believe it. I said, wow. I mean, sometimes I would tell these folks, you've got to risk your job in order to save it. So risk it. Take a risk. You may not be punished. You may be rewarded. Now, the problem now for some of my friends like Adam Kinzinger or Liz Cheney, their problem is not that they took a great risk, and so far it may not pay off for them. Their problem is there aren't enough people now speaking up. There aren't enough people speaking up. And one other thing I'll say on that too, there are times you do something when you go against the herd where you think you're making a mistake, or you think you're making a political mistake, not a policy mistake. You think you're making a political mistake, and in the end, you might be rewarded for it. Now, the other example I have too, you remember that Terry Schiavo situation back in 2005? A woman in Florida, she was on a feeding tube. It was a tragic situation. She was in a irreversible vegetative state, essentially. And her husband wanted to remove life support, and the parents objected. And they went to court. The courts all sided with the parents, and they made the decision to withdraw the feeding tube. And I remember that vote. I mean, I was stunned that, when I was in Congress for all 3 or 4 months, and Tom DeLay was the House Majority Leader at the time. And I heard rumblings that this was going to be voted on. And I said to him, we're not going to have to vote on this thing in Florida, are we? He says, don't worry about it, It's not. And I said, okay, I'm new here, so all right. So I was on Thursday or Wednesday. I get a call on Saturday. Everybody needs to come down to Washington to vote on this Terry Schiavo case. And I couldn't believe it. And the next day was Palm Sunday. And I'm thinking, and the Church House, and what affected my thinking, I was at a dinner of a Catholic university on Saturday night. It was a charitable dinner. I happened to be sitting at a table with a couple of the priests from the university. I'm not Catholic, by the way. And I mentioned that I had to go down to Washington on Sunday. It's Saturday night. I have to go down there tomorrow to vote Sunday night on this bill. And I remember the priest said to me, why would they have you do something like that on Palm Sunday? I said, well, Father, this is kind of being ginned up by the pro-life movement, and this is a way to burnish their credentials. And that's why they're doing this. And, oh my goodness, this has nothing to do with that issue. And I'm listening to these priests then get into nuances of end of life and Catholic theology, and it's very nuanced, and this has nothing to do with that. I said, oh, really? Okay. So I go down to Washington the next day, and I go down there, tell the whip of the House, Roy Blunt, I'm coming down here to give you a quorum, then I'm going to vote against this turkey. This is a bad thing to do. He said, well, you're going to be in a minority here. And I said, well, I don't care. So we go down there, and I was one of 5 Republicans to vote against it in the House. A whole bunch of Democrats voted for that bill, by the way. And I just remember when it happened, there was a day where a lot of people were calling and screaming at me, you murdered this woman, Terry Schiavo. Wow, it's pretty rough. And then like 2 days later, it all turned. And I said, American people aren't stupid. They said, Mike, why would the Congress intervene in a case like this? I mean, it was a separation of powers issue. There was a federalism issue. There's really no federal nexus. It was a state issue, and it was a judicial matter. And a lot of people said, why would they get involved in a very private, personal, tragic family situation? And what are they doing with their time? And why would they come in? It's not like the troops are running out of body armor, or the government's about to shut down. It was to deal with a feeding tube case in Florida. You can deal with a feeding tube case every 5 minutes probably in this country, given that what happens in America. And I've dealt with these, by the way, personally, my own family. And I think this is but people are smart. They recognize that this was something that we ought not to do, and it offended the sensibilities of a lot of folks who probably had experiences, and they said they wouldn't want the government to step in their family. And so the point is, I thought I made a political error when I voted the way I did. I felt right about the vote. I'm just going to get a lot of hell for this one. And as it ended up, I'm glad I did it, because it was helped brand me in a good way. But I'm just saying that sometimes you have to take risks. Take a risk, and you might be surprised what the reaction is.
Question over here.
Would you have any comments on state legislatures that want to overrule what people that sort of call elections and say, hey, we can change it?
Yeah, I mean, wow. I mean, there was talk, of course, after the 2020 election of some states trying to come up with alternative slates of electors. In other words, that would be unthinkable. And to be fair, in 2016, I remember having people come to me, this was on the Democratic side, and they said, I know you don't like Trump, why don't you, what do you think about, having the, an alternative slate of electors for Pennsylvania, since Hillary Clinton won the national vote, why not throw Pennsylvania's vote to her? I said, well, we can't do that. I mean, Trump won Pennsylvania by 44,000 votes. I didn't vote for him, but the outcome's the outcome, and it would be a betrayal if those electors voted for someone else. And then here we fast forward to 2020, and now the shoe's on the other foot. That wasn't serious because Hillary conceded, but Trump, of course, never conceded to Biden. And then now you have people saying that we can do alternative slates of electors, which I don't think is possible. Even in a contested election, you have to have one slate, not two. It would be uncharted waters, and so I just think it's unthinkable that we could go down that road, because and I think it speaks to a larger issue when you see people like the Secretary of State of Georgia, Brad Raffensperger. I just read about some Republican election official in one county in Texas, who are being pushed out of their positions because they will not accept a predetermined outcome in an election. In other words, when you're an election administrator, my experience is those people don't want trouble, whether they're Republican or Democrat. They want to run an election. They want it to be done fairly. They don't want any incidents. They want to count the votes, and when the votes are counted, they're going to announce a winner, whoever it is. It's not about them. Their job is it's totally administrative. It's almost clerical. That's what they're doing. It's dangerous when people who are running for these positions or are going to be appointed to these positions say, "Hey, I have," they come in with an outcome in mind, and what will they do to get to that outcome? That scares me. That probably scares me more than anything else. When you hear all this talk about his democracy, that scares me. If these election officials, who are typically fair, they might be Republican or Democrat, but they all tend to be fair, and they try to be fair. Now you have some exceptions to that, but overwhelmingly fair people trying to run it clean. And if we get people in there who have agendas that are not honorable, then I worry about the state of our democracy.
Any other questions in the room? If not, I have one final question from online that I think would be a good place to end. No? So, you know, whether it is the issue you were just talking about, you know, the basic question is, what can people do? Whether it's on, you know, specific issues like that one, or even more broadly, you know, we just spent an hour and 15 minutes talking about how divided we are as a country. What can people do to, you know, do things that make us more united, not divided?
You know, I think turn the channel. You know, turn the watch the other side. Listen to, or you know, go to another news site. And I'm asking people to be better consumers of information. You know, you go to sites that at least, you know, where you can be assured that you're reading something that is factual. May have opinions, may not agree with them, but at least there are editors involved. I mean, those are the most important things you can do. And perhaps more than anything else, try to figure out ways to have conversations with people who are, you know, have different views than you do. And don't assume that the other person is somehow evil or, you know, bad, you know, is mean-spirited or a bad person. I mean, some are, but I think you have to go into this with the attitude that the other person is honorable, has a life. They believe things that you don't, but they're not bad people. And you have to get back to that. If you believe the person who disagrees with you is your enemy, you know, we're all in trouble. And that's part of the challenge that we're facing in this country, that people don't want to talk to each other. You know, I mean, and even in Washington, I'll tell you what, there are some people with whom I didn't agree on policy. Even the Freedom Caucus guys, I could tell you, Mark Meadows, and I'm just talking on the Republican side. Mark Meadows and Jim Jordan and Mick Mulvaney, with whom I had disagreements. But, you know, I was friendly with all three of them, though. You have to be able to compartmentalize this stuff. It's not personal. I mean, I disagree with Mick Mulvaney on the way he wanted to run budgets, and Mark Meadows on some of his tactics, and Jim Jordan, you know, with what he was doing. But I could talk to Jim Jordan about wrestling. Penn State, you know, you wrestled for, you know, the national champion. We talk about wrestling. So you have to talk to these people, you know, even the ones you disagree with. You know, on the left, you know, Barbara Lee, a very progressive Democrat, African-American woman from California. You know, a lot of people say, oh, you can't deal with her. I was on a committee with her. We traveled together once or twice for congressional delegations. I said, you know what, you know, she's all right. You know, you talk to her things. You know, we're not going to agree on a lot of stuff, but there are going to be things we can actually agree on. And don't stereotype anybody in your own mind and say that they're irredeemable. And that's, I think, the problem. If the other guy is irredeemable, is an enemy, you know, you're never going to be able to have the conversation. So that's probably the most important thing you do. It's got to start at a very local, basic level. Thanksgiving will be a great test this year for a lot of families, but you start there and then try to find problems you can work on together that, you know, that they don't have to be so damn political. I mean, some of this stuff, I mean, I just can't believe that we politicize everything in this country anymore. I mean, just that when everything becomes political, we're in trouble. And that's a problem. We don't even debate policy anymore half the time. It's all cultural, and we're fighting about the culture. It's just really unhealthy. There's still a lot more that unites us and divides us. I mean, look, as bad as it is here right now, as difficult as it is, people are still dying to get in here. You know, it's a great place. There's something special. So we got something special. We just shouldn't lose it. Don't destroy it.
Well, we will leave it there. Please join me in thanking Congressman Charlie Dent.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Pass that on.